All right. So we are here to discuss Chapter 2, Concepts and Terms from Brain of the Firm. And this is our second session of the Brain of the Firm reading group. So Chapter 2, as described in the front of the book, it says... if Chapter 2 is read carefully and the reader doggedly refuses to be put off, he will be armed with the first set of tools he needs. There's a special glossary of cybernetic terms at the back of the book so that people can refresh their understanding if necessary. You may well find that these strange terms soon become old friends. They deserve to be, or I should not have bothered to introduce them. So we are getting our concepts and terms here, especially with a focus on the concept of feedback. What did people have to say about this chapter? Put your hand up if you have something to say. Shane, go ahead.
I think it's very interesting that, the first chapter sets up the problem, and we're all familiar with it, right? It's the problem of complexity, accelerating complexity, regulation, and so on. But it's chapter 2 really gets into the absolute sort of bedrock, foundational sort of stuff. It opens with this guy, it's my copy here is so densely annotated because there's just so much being kind of delivered in this salvo of a couple of pages, and then the back half of the chapter it goes into the feedback stuff, but these first couple of pages are really interesting, right? That he's saying we shall discuss the nature of systems and their control in a new language. Okay. The first principle of control is that the controller is part of the system under control. The controller is not something stuck onto the system by a higher authority, which then accords it managerial prerogatives. Okay, so straight up mind-blowing stuff right out the gate. The controller, moreover, grows with the system. And if we look back through time, we see that the controller evolved with the system too. For these reasons, it is best to ask how a system under control is aware of itself and its own states, rather than to ask how a controller can become aware of the state of the system. So, immanence. The control is immanently embedded in the system. It is not an external thing. Maybe a really good sort of visual for this is the centrifugal governor on a steam engine, the little spinny guy with the little steel balls or whatever. And, if you look at the steam engine, you might think, oh, well, the governor sits on top of the big bulk of the engine. So it must be some sort of king, that rules the engine or something like that. But then if you just look at the wiring diagram of how all those components are connected to each other, it's clear that the governor is inside of the engine, realistically, that it is inside the flow of causes of the engine, which points again to Beer's thing of trying to get us away from entity thinking, just looking at entities in space. You would see the governor is above the engine, and that just because of the way the semiotic kind of neural weirdness of our brain or our senses works, we kind of interpret that as having some kind of meaning, right? That the entity is above the other entity in some kind of symbolic sense. But looking at the flow of causes, it's not above at all. It's completely embedded. Beer wants to shift our attention onto that embeddedness and away from thinking of there's a little king on top of the pile of stuff. And also the fact that he's talking about awareness right up here, right? That it's really interesting, right? Because I think in the first chapter we got this glimpse of a kind of vitalist machinic ontology of some kind, right? Where in kind of intelligence is distributed throughout the universe as a kind of natural force. It's a natural force in the world for things to be kind of aware in some sense of themselves. He then goes on to say that it's not consciousness we're talking about there. It's not we shouldn't really draw too many analogies with our representational symbolic thinking, but that just self-analysis or self-reflection, reflexivity, is a natural consequence of just feedback loops. It's a thing that occurs in the world, so that the governor on top of the steam engine can be aware in some sense of the state of the entire system, or the states that are relevant to the system.
Right. Yeah. I read this stuff and all I think about is Hegel. So yeah, Hegel's ontology and the ontological reversal of Kant that Hegel does. This reminds me a lot of that. So let's go to Jake.
Yeah, on the subject of control within a system, like when I was reading this passage, I was trying to move my brain from things standing above. I was thinking of it in puppet wires terms, like the thing is puppeting above the system, but then thinking about the puppeteer within the system, but then that's not going far enough itself, right? But like each thing within the system has their own wire, like that diagram in the Designing Freedom book. Everyone's pulling a string. And then there's also things maybe that aren't even animate that have their own strings to pull as well, like socially necessary labor time within capitalism, maybe. Although maybe that's not included in part of controller, or maybe that's more of like an emergent thing. So yeah, I went from trying to think of this thing, just moving the puppeteers within the system, to like spreading these strings out all within the system, where the controller is maybe not even just like one person or like even a group of people even really.
Right. So Shane has mentioned how Beer is encouraging us to get away from entity thinking, and it will be interesting to see how he represents emergent phenomena in his control approach, given that they are not necessarily clearly entities. Brett, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a sort of a bit of a confusion, a bit of a question. Something I'm not very clear on still is like what counts as, he asked this question directly, what does count as a response to a stimulus? And I'm sort of wondering though, like if you sort of start adjudicating this, doesn't everything just respond to its stimulus? Or maybe is there things that maybe don't? I guess I'm a little confused there and still.
I think I can kind of maybe offer part of a sort of answer to that. I think it's a little bit more clear in Heart of the Enterprise when he's talking about like identifying systems, that I think Beer's way of thinking about this stuff is that whatever is real in itself, like whatever reality really is a kind of rhizomatic tangle of just disgustingly complex processes. And when we look at them, it's our kind of like judgment of coherence, like that identifying systems. So when we talk about systems, they kind of, like we're talking about a symbolic kind of thing, that it really exist in itself, or the way it exists in itself is something incomprehensibly alien to us. But I think he kind of gets to this with the stimulus response things, that it's when there appears to be coherence between apparent stimulus and apparent response, that's when we think of it as being a system. And the possibility is always left out there that, like, because the thing is unknowably complex, we could in fact be mistaken, right? Like he says with the cat, right? Like you show a cat a board that just has "fuck off" printed on it, and the cat might in fact leave the room, but that's probably a coincidence. But it's within the realm of possibility the cat can read, but we'll never really know until we do further experimentation. So I guess it's along that kind of Kantian angle, right? That like whatever is out there is itself, and we have to just apprehend it through the kind of structures of coherence and coincidence that we use to apprehend things, which is fine because we identify things experimentally and we look at them and go, oh yeah, every time I poke it, it screams. Okay, that's probably a response, right? But you always have to kind of keep in mind there's always the possibility that you might have got it wrong. It could be screaming for its own reason, and maybe the poke had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I like about cybernetics is that it does actually seem every system at some point as something that responds to like stimulus, and if it doesn't respond, it's not there. But really, I'm sort of like he goes on back and forth in terms of whether like that can be like universal to everything, or if it's just like the things you see in the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there certainly is something real that is connected, right? There is a connection, a network of causes and a network of like flows of energy and stuff, which is definitely doing things. But we don't have direct access to that network of things. We can't just examine it. We just have to kind of rely on our judgment of even what we identify as stimulus and response. Like we tend to identify discrete events, and we tend to have a pretty hard time identifying continual flows. That's actually kind of what Beer is trying to teach us, is how to identify, like how to look at continuous things rather than like discrete pops and bangs as stimulus response events. But yeah, I think he's kind of paving the way to get there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we could probably this in the terms that Beer lays out when he says the first principle of control is that the controller is part of the system under control, which is to say the identification of stimulus would be a part of the awareness of the system under consideration when you are considering the observer and the observed, right? So again, it's that Hegelian term of saying, oh no, it's not that the thing in itself is a plenitude that exists beyond the observer's understanding and is inaccessible to us, but somehow inherent to things. It's that the lack of clarity or perfect information or perfect understanding, which, you know, Kant imputes to like universal consciousness and God, is in itself limited, right? The system, the system's inability to identify a stimulus, it refers to a kind of lack in the system itself. If the controller is a part of the system, right? So I think that's maybe some direction that we could think about going forward, where you think about that the observer is implicated in the system. What are the implications of that? What does that mean?
There's at least two levels of kind of observing. I think we need to take apart there. There's the sensitivity of the controller to the states of the rest of the system in which it's embedded, and then there's our, like, if we are observers trying to work out what control is possible in the system, there's us observing that, right? So that's probably worth disambiguating.
I just mean in the sense that when we talk about empirical observation, we are talking about a system we are implicated in.
Yes, exactly right. Because of course, like when we engage with the system to try and observe it, to learn something about it, we are ourselves kind of engaged with it. So it's engagement all the way down, right? It's turtles all the way down. I do think it's very interesting that Beer is he seems to be saying that like control is possible to the extent that the controller is sensitive, and the kinds of sensitivity that it has. Which is very, very interesting, right? That, like, I mean, you'd be able to grade different sort of controllers. You'd be able to, like, alter these things by making a controller more sensitive, or by kind of adapting it in those kinds of ways, right? I just found that the sensitivity thing was very, very interesting there. And I guess I'm not sure why it jumped out at me from this text particularly, but like, you know, we as human beings are sensitive to certain things, right? Like, but we're not sensitive to carcinogens, right? Like, there can be asbestos all around you and you won't sense it. But if human brains all gang together and invent science, they can become sensitive to carcinogens, like in aggregate, right? That, like, you can have a kind of like meta control or meta sensitivity that emerges out of the combination of sensitive systems that has a power of sensing much greater than the combination, it's greater than the sum of its parts, right? Like, the ability for science to detect carcinogenic materials and to detect cancers is vastly higher than the capacity of just adding up all the brains involved. It's a change in kind, right? Like, so I think that's worth bearing in mind for like Beer's kind of like stacked layers of meta systems, and how they're like meta control and meta control and meta control can actually, it's, you know, you might think because the systems are all kind of immanent to themselves, that like adding layers of control on top of them might be kind of like diminishing returns, whatever. But there is this sense in which, like, because the meta systems of control can be more sensitive, like radically more sensitive, they can actually be vastly more effective. And so, you know, living in a society that has science, you're more effective at avoiding cancer-causing substances than you would be as an individual.
Well, and that gets to the whole idea of like dealing with Ashby's law, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
I do want to get to the people who have been waiting to speak. So, Steve, let's go to you.
I mean, I was actually thinking along similar lines as what Shane was just saying, where he ended up on, which is like, I was a little concerned reading this when we emphasized stimulus so much that we're just sort of pushing the problem, right? Because the whole feedback loop really only works when you're comparing that stimulus to some other referent, right? And there isn't a lot of discussion about where that comes from. While I was reading it, this sort of came more to mind when talking about like the feedback transfer functions and the transfer functions, which, you know, from like an engineering perspective, sure, like we understand how to design those to a certain degree, and that's sort of well understood mathematics. But like when moving that into sort of natural systems, it's sort of like, well, you know, sure, maybe some systems can be adaptive and you can come up and figure those out. But like in general, there's no reason to think that will happen, right? And that made me think of his, pond scum computer experience, right? Which was just assuming that, oh, you know, we'll let it do its thing and naturally it will self-regulate and get there. But like, yeah, it didn't, because you need to make sure that there's some imperative to actually like close that loop and get to the stability. I think I felt like I saw his blind faith that could happen right at the end of the chapter when he talked about, you know, oh, as long as it's negative feedback, then we're going to get to ultra stability, which also isn't really true, right? In general. So, I mean, you know, I appreciate it, and certainly the emphasis on stimulus and embedding the systems into the world is seems right. But it does seem like he's pushing the problem a little bit to focus on that embeddedness and just the stimulus, when there's still a big sort of piece of the puzzle that's kind of missing. And I don't know, maybe he talks about it more in the rest of the book. But
yeah, I think we'll have to look more at what he presents later in the book there, in terms of specifying what he means. In terms of the negative feedback thing, I think we can get there at the end of the chapter when we talk about the feedback example, because that probably bears some clarifying. Matt, please go ahead.
I think Wiener defined it just a little bit differently, in that he emphasized sort of goal-directed behavior, and if like a system seems to actually be taking actions in some kind of way, then I just thought that that flip of emphasis was interesting. Also, with just inability to see like what is an entity around you. I was thinking about how different systems like respond at very different timescales. So like your immune system adapts, but over the course of like days and weeks, versus like, your hand, which will, go away from a hot stove instantaneously, or like, your chemical nervous system responds a lot more slowly than something electronic, and, an institution, responds at like, a much bigger time scale. So like, it's not always obvious, like, what around you is like an actual, it's like an entity. Because like, especially if you're sort of optimized for a certain, your consciousness is like, your working memory, but like you're not necessarily realizing what the systems around you were doing.
Right. Yeah, I think another good example of that we could point to is that the communication systems between trees, so the sort of intelligence of forests, that is so slow as to be generally imperceptible to us. So you have to really observe quite closely and thoroughly to be aware of the system responses and how they're connected to each other. Rudy, you had a comment?
Yeah, I think here we're kind of going around a problem that's quite common in control engineering. And I think Beer had in the beginning, when he had his T computer, U computer, and P computer. And then there's the problem of what can you observe? Based on your observations, what do you want to do? And then what can you act on to get there? And these are three different problems. And I feel like in this chapter and in his VSM model, they get a bit more confused. But he was definitely aware of them, because he talked about the TUB computers, and he was never really able to get this core. But I feel like this sort of glances a bit over it, and your basic controls, you also glance a bit over it. But definitely, because I'm an aerospace engineer by training, the part of observability is a big problem in airplanes, because you really can't observe your own speed in many ways. or you can't tell what's the speed of the wind. So then I feel like there is a bit missing here that is not totally clear or not made explicit enough.
Right. That's a very good point. Okay. So shall we carry on a little bit here? The next section, we could look at
like page 28, where we get to ultra-stable systems, and because it does follow on from what Rudy was just saying about like the sensing, decision, and then acting. He starts to elaborate on that.
Right. That's a good point. So we talk a little bit about internal stability, disturbances, and then get to the concept of ultra-stable systems. So what do people have to say about the section on ultra-stability?
What page was that? Sorry.
We really kick off on page 28 with the diagram figure 6. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, it's actually kind of related to something that's Matt said in the Discord beforehand about reinforcement learning. That this stuff kind of reminded me of as well, especially like exactly what Matt quoted was to decide between A and B, the controller must compare the outcomes of making either choice against its criterion of stability. To do this, the simplest strategy is to do a little avoiding and a little reinforcing, testing out the results of its criterion, and then setting the switch. And there's this thing in reinforcement learning about exploitation versus exploration, which is kind of reminiscent of this, but probably not exactly the same. Where if you exploit like some reward or overemphasize a punishment a little bit too much without doing more exploration, like different kinds of actions, you may kind of not evolve like your system, not learn as much as you possibly could. But if you do too much exploration, your system is going to become so unstable and going to be doing so much kind of searching around that it's not going to learn enough. It's not going to exploit what it knows. And yeah, this whole bit after the sensorium and the repeller tract, the transducers and all of that reminded me of that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Brett, go ahead.
I just find this whole section interesting because sort of for my day job, I work in DevOps engineering, and basically my job is to build these systems that don't fall over when they get like random data or when they start getting pounded with whatever happens to the system. It needs to continue running.
Right, for sure. It's more complicated than an electrical circuit, but dealing with the same principles. Shane, go ahead. Shane, I think I might have got cut off.
I think I lost audio for a moment there. Yeah, it's very interesting that like in the big new DevOps thing is Kubernetes, right? Which is like directly from like Kubernetes cybernetics, right? Because it's if you want to like auto scaling, right? Like your website's getting the Reddit hug of death or whatever, and like you just got to spawn more containers until that stops happening, which is a pretty classic kind of like sensing a problem, making some decision, which is probably just some lump of JavaScript or whatever, and then doing something until the problem goes away, until the sense of burning stops. Just like keep adding more servers. I think there's something here in this section that is worth kind of probably underlining, that the objective here is, he outlines an ultra-stable system as a system that can do this, that can survive arbitrary and unforecast interference, is known to cyberneticians as an ultra-stable system. So in a way, the auto-scaling AWS stuff or whatever is kind of foreseen, right? Like it is an expected behavior that your servers will not be able to respond fast enough to enough stimulus, whatever, or traffic. And so there is a transfer function, which is increment number of servers by 1, and that just keeps happening, right? But that's all within the realm of the known and the planned. What we're kind of emphasizing here is stuff that is unforeseen. So I mean the example he uses is that of imagine a computer that would detect that there's a fire in the building and would get up and walk out, and that's pretty clever. But what if instead of detecting fire, it just detected in general that something is wrong and left the building? That's kind of more the registry he's going for there. Yeah, I think that's just something really to emphasize, right? That it's kind of a meta level above just the level of responding to a problem. It's like responding to a problem about problems, is what he's trying to steer us in the direction.
Right, the good old unknown unknowns. Matt, you had your hand up.
Yeah, that section about the computer that just just knows something's going wrong and then just has like a bunch of like things it can do when things go wrong. I felt personally made fun of that by that, because like just before then, I've been like teaching myself this language Rust, and like I've never done low level stuff before. I'm a Python person, and so like in a lot of cases, it's just about putting a little character or removing a character to make something like a reference or or whatever, and just so I'll just see I was in basically that feedback loop. The compiler's yelling at me all right, but without understanding anything, let's just add some ampersands and or remove some ampersands, and let's see what happens. Like there's no knowledge about the situation. It's just that's a response that gets me out of trouble often enough.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Classic. Like, how many pointers do you want? How many borrows? How many pointers to pointers do you want before the compiler is happy? Yeah.
I think we've all been there. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of emphasize how much I sort of appreciated the focus on sort of the A representational system here, right? Like, when we're taught feedback control theory, like the question of representation is kind of irrelevant, right? At least from the engineering perspective. Now, when you get into, higher level control systems, so I work in robotics and like AI robotics. So like, I use this stuff on a regular basis, but, once you start looking at using controllers in the context of like more abstract behavior, there's kind of the two sides of it, right? There's the more traditional GoFi representational systems, and then there's the more control Rodney Brooks sort of Brattenberg machine background, which obviously is much more related to this. So it was just good to see, like, from the control perspective, really the framing of this, where like it kicks off really saying, the representation of what's happening on the outside is totally irrelevant. And to be so emphatic about that, I think is, it's really powerful in the sense of recognizing the scope and possibilities of what you can do when you focus on these embedded feedback systems. And, that's extrapolated through, the Brattenberg, if people are familiar with that stuff, the vehicles book. It doesn't take very much to start really getting into, actually interesting behavior in the world.
Yeah, I mean, certainly this touches on the whole good old-fashioned AI thing and Dreyfus's critique of it, and you could even see some of the stuff about the Chinese room being relevant to this too. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I have actually more of a question than anything else about the not caring about where the stimulus comes from, if that was what we were touching on there. Like there's this particular sentence where Beer says, throughout, please note the system is unconcerned about what it is that may have been interfering with it. Does Beer there mean throughout this section or throughout the book or throughout cybernetics? And if he does it mean it more broadly, then I'm a little confused, because like if you felt a burning sensation on your finger, you would want to know whether, presume you didn't see it, that whether that came from a flame or if something's horribly going wrong with your finger and it just produced a burning sensation. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think what he's getting at, and I think it is, I'm not even sure if it's actually on that page or if it's on a previous page of the thing I'm thinking of, but he does say that the sensing and the sense of the stimulus is internal to the system. The cause is external, but in a sense, the system doesn't actually have access to the real, like whatever stands in the place of that real cause, right? Like whatever that is. The system only really, in this like imminent kind of feedback thing, it only really has the signal of what it has, and the signal is kind of internally generated because the sensor is internal to the system. Which, I mean, you might think with like, oh yeah, so if your hand is burning, there's a kind of like naive realism to the notion that like the flame is touching your hand and then you just know about the flame directly. But what's kind of really happening is like you have a nervous sensation that is caused by something that is going wrong. And we eventually learn to kind of connect these sensations to each other, but they're not like intrinsically connected to each other. It's a matter of habit. If you've ever experienced like hallucinations or like, I don't know, it's something equivalent to phantom limb or whatever, it's fairly clear that like the internal control structures of the brain are capable of being stimulated by things that simply aren't there. So this is kind of why it's so important for a system to be appropriately sensitive. Because if its internal bandwidth for sensitivity is too low, it won't be able to actually register the internally things that are happening externally. But if it's also too large, it'll maybe go into like crazed hallucination sort of space where it's actually responding to internal noise more so than anything else. So the reason that the system is indifferent or unconcerned or indifferent to what is interfering with it is because that's a kind of sort of transcendental problem. Now, in reality, of course, it's all meshed together and like the system is involved with that external thing. But in terms of sensing, there's a kind of transcendent kind of problem there that like the structure of the sensing is what informs the action to be taken, not necessarily the structure of the thing that caused the sensing.
Right.
Does that make any sense? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to what Steve was talking about with good old-fashioned AI, right? Because the good old-fashioned AI response would be, okay, we need a system that understands the ontology of fire and how the ontology of fire as a concept connects to the ontology of body and what the implications are when concept fire connects to concept body. And based on that, we can motivate an action because we have this sophisticated ontology that understands representationally the conceptual linkages. But of course, good old-fashioned AI ran into endless problems of being slow, being just ineffective, and the approach that Beer is kind of advocating here ended up being the AI approach that won the day, more or less. Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, the idea of like, I need to be able to perceptually recognize a fire as some sort of object in the world before I can recognize that I should move away from it is kind of silly when, you know, you feel the burning, just go away from it. But, and, you know, it's just worth, I think, mentioning too, like, we're speaking specifically with respect to stimuli here, but there's a dual of it too in terms of action, which is that, you know, that same sort of dichotomy of the GoFi representation versus action with affordances and theories of affordances, which is that, you know, if I need to be able to recognize all types of chairs in order to actually be able to sit down on it and say, yeah, that's a chair, that's a hard problem because, you know, chairs come in all sorts of forms. But if you're actually only concerned about sitting, then you can look for more fundamental things like, you know, flat surfaces that are parallel to the ground or something like that, because your primary goal is actually to behave in the world, which, whether that's reacting to stimuli or actually taking action, you know, moving away from this representational sense. You don't need to understand fires or chairs in some sort of platonic sense. You need to be able to like see the stimuli and figure out what to do with that, whether it's reflexively or just more, you know, more deliberatively, but in a way where you can avoid that whole representation and ontology issue, because it's hard. And, you know, we can solve proofs and play chess with it, but hasn't really gotten us very far in terms of like behaving in the world more directly.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair to Jake, I think you were saying that you were talking primarily about the problem of identifying, distinguishing one stimulus from another stimulus, as opposed to the how do I act in the first place problem. But yes, that's kind of the substance of what was going on there. Matt, please go ahead.
lot of stories on like illusions and like how your body has like a communication system. Done a lot of psych research, including in a schizophrenia lab. So but I will limit myself to one anecdote that I think is kind of multi-layered. There's a famous experiment where there's this fly that the only way it knows it's eaten enough is from a stretch receptor in its gut. And if you cut that nerve, then it will literally eat till it explodes. And like, I feel like that also works as like, the rate of profit is like the only thing that our system really, kind of gets. And so the only way that the coal factory as a system, as an intelligent, emergent thing of its own, really knows that if it's producing enough coal is if, that there's enough profits for the shareholders. And so, like that's, I think that works.
Right. Definitely. That's a good example. So Jake's just been saying that there's the symbolic systems combined with these kind of networks that we've been talking about as like a kind of second order approach to these problems. And certainly we do that as well, right? Like we what was it? The Carnap's, what is it? The Aufbau, right? The Carnap's attempt to develop a empirical system for understanding science and the world from first principles conceptually was kind of a mess and didn't end up working out. But it doesn't mean like it's kind of overextending one aspect of what we do in the world and trying to make that an explanatory framework for all of reality, which is kind of the mistake that philosophy has made for a very long time, which Heidegger kind of rectified to some degree. All right. Let's move on then. So we've talked about ultra stability. We've talked about stimulus here again, transduction, the sensory input channel, the motor output channel. I think that should be pretty straightforward for everyone. So maybe let's move on to talking about the anastomotic reticulum. Does anyone have anything to say about that?
What a word! Goddamn. No, this thing really jumped out at me. Is like, this is deep learning now, right? So but there's specifically the kind of emphasis on the kind of super complexity of the middle part. Especially when there's bits here about like the neuron is a kind of example of this. There's input, there's some weird bullshit in the middle, and there's this output signal. But if a neuron itself, if any given neuron is like equivalent to an 8th order nonlinear differential equation, like pretty hardcore stuff, but then there's 10 to the power of 10 of them in the brain in a completely like crazed, entangled sort of structure, then it's computationally irreducible to work out what the fuck is going on in there. So it's like, and that only gets worse when you add brains together, right? Like, so that he says like when a person or a manager or whatever, manager to use the term here because he's pitching this to managers, when a manager makes a decision, like it's a differential equation of a sort, right? Like there's an input and there's a decision and there's some action at the back of it. Good luck figuring out why that happened, and then, if a committee makes a decision, well, fuck, you're completely screwed, right? It rapidly converges on needing a computer bigger than Jupiter to work out, like, just even one of these things. And then you have a whole society, these goddamn things that are just like doing this stuff continuously in real time. And it's absolutely irreducible. So what
you're saying, Shane, is that we cannot just do ad hominems about Orange Man and understand the state of politics in the world today.
Well, I feel like Orange Man's variety might have been pruned to such an extent that maybe you can make sort of general statements about him, but This is explosive stuff, right? Like kind of admitting the computational power of matter in itself, and like the amount of stuff that raw material can actually do. And then you have smart material with brain stuff, neurons, and so on. Like there are intelligent configurations of matter which rapidly escape from your ability to represent them. And I think later then he's like, trying to work, like, in a given set, like there is a differential equation in there somewhere, but trying to work it out using math is probably not going to work for you. Like, you're not going to get there with a chalkboard. So you're going to have to infer what the differential equation is by experimentation, or give up on inferring it. You just accept that whatever that block of matter is doing is weird and intelligent and cool somehow, and you feed it pizza and Coke, and then out comes something that you care about at the other side. And you only restrict yourself to caring about the inputs and the outputs, and just let the material do its bizarre stuff. You know, it's a very refreshing position. It's getting away from that Cartesianism and Platonism and all that kind of horrible shit.
Right. Yes. And so, Nico, you had something to say.
Sorry, I forgot the whole Zoom controls here. Yeah, I was going to bring up the same conversation as earlier, and of course now on the reticulum and sensory black boxing here. My background, I'm an engineer as well, but I'm also an ecologist, and one of the main things I've studied really is global change ecology and how species might respond to certain stimuluses that, are driven by climate change factors across, certain, nutrient gradients, climate gradients, latitudinal gradients, etc. And I forgot what I was going to say now. But yeah, the whole black box thing in that case, it's very, very difficult when you try to understand how to help a system adapt, if it makes sense. But it's very, I think, important to take the kind of subjective view, understanding how organisms receive this sensory data, such a changing phenology of flowers, vegetation, and can adapt their, migration for Arctic birds. We're seeing a lot of shifts in what organisms they predate on, or otherwise, you're naturally selected against. That's about it I was going to say there. Just wanted to put in a little ecological metaphors.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's a really good point, especially when, unlike in sort of Ashby's robots, we can't tinker with ecosystems so easily to understand the black box. All right, Caleb, please go ahead.
I was just going to say something real quick. I had a really very superficial introduction to Nahuatl philosophy, like Aztec philosophy. And someone was saying that the main goal of the philosophy was this phrase that meant how to keep your balance in a slippery world. They didn't pretend to we want to figure out what's true. We just want to keep our balance in a world that seems very slippery. And I just thought it was it lacked the sort of hubris of we're going to figure everything out. We're going to nail it all down, and then we're going to get. But they were not interested in figuring everything out. They were just interested in surviving, and I like that, and it seems relevant. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a good philosophical principle for sure. Absolutely. All right. Okay, so we'll move on from the anastomotic reticulum to the next section where the anastomotic reticulum, I believe, is technically called is it now the servo mechanism that it becomes in the engineering parlance? Yeah. So here we are talking about transfer functions. We get into some algebra. What did people have to say about this section? I can just start off by saying, I am not the best at algebra. I had a pretty bad mathematics education growing up. But this all made an intuitive sense to me because I've spent so much time with an analog synthesizer and an oscillator, and you feed one thing into the next, and you adjust the knobs, and the mathematical principles that Beer is describing here are very tactile and intuitive when you can see the lines go up and down and the sound change. So that was really my background to coming to this section here. Yeah, I should say an oscilloscope too. That's always good to have. All right, Jake, please go ahead.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, the main thing to take away from this part is probably that, like, we start with this dumb machine, which is small f, which doesn't kind of feed back on itself or do anything, much more of anything. And then we layer on top of it this feedback system, which kind of modifies the input into that system to produce the output that's wanted at the end. So you're turning like a dumb machine that just kind of feeds in one end and spits out the other to something which has this kind of feedback process. But I have to say, coming out of it, I didn't get in my head like a rigorous definition of feedback at all, really. And like at the beginning, and like in page 32, he says, it would not on the face of it be correct to describe a stimulus response arrangement as a feedback system. The term is used so loosely in some quarters that almost anything which procures a reaction to itself is described as a feedback. What the term means strictly is so fundamental to cybernetic thinking that its connotation should be unraveled with some care. So maybe we should be careful about this, and maybe I do need to get a better idea before we move on here about what that actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's not make the mistake that undergrads make, where they're like, "Oh yeah, this is fundamental, and I need to understand it." Great, I got it. Let's go. Let's move on. Okay, Shane, and then Nico.
Yeah, a couple of quick ones. Yeah, I guess like maybe it's worth remembering Beer's thing from the start that he's going to try and build up a language about how to talk about these things, but he's not that concerned with the language by the end. Like he's trying to get the concept to embed itself in your head more so than I don't know, rigorously. He does try to kind of like define these things, but I think it's quite a nebulous. It's a difficult and nebulous sort of concept, even though it seems on the surface kind of not super difficult. But really grasping the intuition of what are the consequences of this is the hard part. I also think it's very interesting here that he introduces the notion that the controller, like the feedback thing, needs its own smarts in order to keep up with the complexity of what the thing is doing. So if the black box itself is doing something very complex and it's kind of hard to know what's coming next, the feedback thingamajig needs to have enough smarts to keep up with it to achieve the stability it wants. I don't think he mentions Ashby in this chapter, but it's very much in that kind of Ashby's law of requisite variety, right? That like your controller needs enough variety to achieve the task, and that's always relative. And it also implies this kind of tower problem of like, well, what if you needed a controller of the controller, and what if you needed a controller of the controller of the controller? Would it not be irreducible? And the answer is yeah, it kind of is. And so you have to be kind of smart about how you stack those things up, because it is a losing game to like just add more and more stacks of feedback circuits on top of each other, because each of them will necessarily lose resolution as they go up. I'm really bad at math, and I think I kind of understand the algebra that's here, but I'm kind of interested to hear from the more mathy folks if this all checks out.
Yeah, I mean the example that comes to mind in terms of the inadequacy of the feedback mechanism, just because it's really recent, is I have an HDMI switch connecting 3 inputs to the input on my TV. And I configured the my TV to accept what would be the normal inputs from what you would expect from HDMI sources in terms of color information and stuff like that. And all the switch can do is forward. All it can do is transfer the information. It's just trying to get the purest transfer possible. But I connected a Nintendo Switch up to that switch. And the Nintendo has really wonky color information that it sends out. So what I would have to do is, if I wanted to keep the switch on there, every single time I switch between devices, I would have to adjust the color again. So what I ended up doing is just pulling the switch out of there and putting it on a different port, because I can dial in the settings for the Switch, the Nintendo Switch. But I that's one and done. And the reason why I had to do that is because the feedback mechanisms on the switcher, the HDMI switcher, are not intelligent enough to deal with those differences. They're just dumb. So that's what came to my mind when I was thinking about this. Anyway, Nico, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I really enjoyed the diagram, of course, on page 34, figure 8, but it really got me thinking more so about, the whole like Lovelockian idea of Gaia. And there's been some, I guess, discussion by a lot of like, kind of like post-humanists, postmodernist philosophers, if you will, using cybernetic theory to understand Gaia not as like the kind of, living organism, but as this like, feedback loop in essence. But this question of self-consciousness versus like, awareness, I think that really drove home for me, I guess how to perceive that, where it's often mysticized as like this, like, kind of like living organism that's actually, understanding what's happening and responding. No, it's more these feedback loops that occur that are very, arising out of these couple processes, whether, it's like tidal currents, methane in the Arctic, if you will, what have you. But that figure there, I think, was just really good. I've taken differential equations, so I understood that the equations in this more or less, but I think this diagram itself really set it straight for me.
Yeah, good old diagrams. Where would we be without them? But yeah, that's a very interesting point regarding the Gaia hypothesis and what we mean by awareness. Bringing what you're saying here to that discussion, I think, is really valuable. Rudy, please go ahead.
So I'm going to take this in another complete different direction. And I feel like one of the better ways to understand feedback is if you have a car and basically the dampers and I know this in Spanish, like when your car goes through a pothole and starts bouncing and goes back to the correct position, this elastic
shock
thing. Shock absorbers. That kind of things are feedback because it's putting your car back in the correct place even when your car is moving over a very bumpy hill. So I feel like that's a way simpler picture than all these, cables going around. So it's just something that pulls you back, right? It's kind of, you have a spring, the spring goes out of place while the spring goes back to the same place it was beginning. And that is a very, very simple feedback mechanism.
Yeah,
right. It's regulation and smoothing, right? Like because the feedback here is maybe the thing that's it's shifting the emphasis a bit away from the point. That the point is the regulation. That like there is something that is desired to be held relatively stable or like to be moved in a particular direction, such as the height that your car is off the ground, and you put something in place to just ensure that more or less always happens. I mean, if you drive off a cliff, it's going to get fucked anyway. But like, yeah, if you go over a little pothole, it should just kind of smooth it out a little.
Yeah, and the other part is there's two components to this. It's not just the springs, but you also need a damper so it doesn't go too fast. So you start changing a bit the response, and that's kind of, I feel, the best way to picture the whole feedback stuff.
Steve, please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things there. Like, one is again this appearance of the referent signal, like, and where that comes from, and the fact that you're always trying to get back to that. But I guess clarifying maybe to Jake's question, because it is true that Beer says like, hey, we need to be absolutely clear about why like things like stimulus response aren't feedback. And then he only really sort of goes through paragraphs to explain what the difference is. But like my takeaway from that sort of what he was trying to get at here is like really the core concept here is the difference, the fact that you are constantly doing this comparison between the nominal and and some measurement that's fed back. Right, that you get this error signal, this discrepancy, and the fact that you're getting an explicit discrepancy is really what you want to pay attention to. And yeah, I mean, there's physical ways that the world works physically, modeled by things like dampers and springs that are tools that we can use to get the sort of responses and stability that we want out of it. And then that stuff's very well understood from a mathematical and physical perspective. And it's implicit in some of this. This is certainly how it starts to get taught to people. My sort of bigger comment is just like the idea that he's using this to talk to managers just still kind of boggles my mind. Like people must have thought of this and going this route, which I can only imagine must be just so foreign a way of framing things. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he says in the second edition, I've added the algebra so you can see my work. And so all the managers are going to get it now. He's like, this is schoolboy algebra. You should be able to do this. Like, come on. Yeah. I think the core like sentence that I picked out of this text, I was looking for it, but I finally found it. He says on page 33, in the middle of paragraph 2, whatever happens at any rate, it is possible to measure the continuous change in the output variable and to compare it with what it is supposed to be. Thus, a measurement is obtained which detects the system's deviation from some norm. It is this measurement which may itself have to undergo some modification, which is fed back to adjust the input so that the existing transfer function determines a corrected output. So I think that's what he's saying when he's like, this is the thing you got to get. I think that's it. That's the core of this concept. So, when we talk about feedback loops in sort of common parlance, like we might have on Skype or something, where it's like, oh yeah, someone doesn't have their headphones in, so then the sound keeps getting fed back and it becomes noise. That's not really what the concept is pointing at here. It would be the thing that adjusts so that error is corrected for would be the feedback mechanism. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, like intentionality and like telos and that kind of like Aristotelian kind of like, goal orientation, whatever, is kind of fundamental here, right? Like, because I mean, when a guitar amp feeds back, it's not, there isn't like anything that's trying to achieve anything. It's just fucking squealing noise, whatever. But that is feedback. The important thing is the intentionality of like an error being corrected deliberately by a system, and not even like deliberately by like a conscious mind that is like observing something and formulating a plan, but even like inside a cell, right? Like there's a certain embedded kind of continuous quasi-teleological sort of thing going on there, where there's variables that it needs to be held relatively stable, and it just like intentionally kind of recorrects that again and again. That's the real core stuff there. So Beer isn't actually all that interested in systems that don't have this kind of self-referential error correcting kind of thing, right? Like, I mean. Yeah. There's all like cybernetics can be used to describe anything in the world, basically. Like or even the way to understand the way things interact with each other. But like the waves crashing on a beach are kind of sort of uninteresting to Beer because they don't have that kind of like solidity to their like circular causation in their feedback loop. It's when a feedback loop establishes a kind of like circle of cause that keeps the thing sustained and like sustained kind of deliberately. That's where his attention really peaks up.
Right. It gets back to all the autopoiesis stuff we talked about on the show. Right. Okay. So any final things that people would like to bring up with this chapter? Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing at the end, I said it again, I'm not really great at math, but like the thing at the very end about the way that feedback absolutely dominates the circuit is the kind of thing that I find very compelling, but that's where it sort of slipped out of my grasp in terms of a mathematical kind of thing. I could kind of follow what he was doing with manipulating the equations, and it smells right, but I'm kind of curious as to like, how did other people react to this bit at the end?
Yeah, I did go through this and like understand how that would work. And I also like I've seen this work on synthesizers. Like you do these things and yeah, you could filter out the noise. But Rudy, please go ahead.
Yeah, again, going back to the car example, like I feel like it's one of the more mundane ones. The moment you put springs in your car doesn't fly, right? It bounces around whenever you find a pothole. So if you think about it this way, what the car does when it finds a pothole is completely defined by the spring nowadays. It's not defined by how the car looks like or whatever. So that's, I think, a way of understanding this.
Okay, that makes sense. So I kind of detected that a point Beer was trying to get at is that these feedback mechanisms are much more effective than you'd initially expect them to be. And the behavior of the overall system is more defined by the feedback mechanism than it is by the rest of the sort of apparatus.
Yeah, that's, I think, the most important point. Like, and say, like, if you go a pothole, what you feel is the springs, even doesn't matter the details of your car.
So the springs are in charge of the interaction, really. Okay, yeah. Okay, that does make intuitive sense. Cool.
Yeah, this is maybe tangential, but the thing I was thinking about here is that if you look at like the sound system of a original Nintendo or a Famicom, the initial signal that is sent into that system is just a click producer. All it does is it produces clicking sounds. And it's the whole feedback system that actually produces like recognizable notes and music out of that. But the input is nothing sophisticated at all. It's just click on and off. That's it. So the feedback system is absolutely predominant over the signal. It's completely unrecognizable from what you put into the system. Steve and then Mark.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, like it turns out, the way that I sort of internalize this is like, it turns out that like it's pretty easy to keep the system from getting more unstable through like positive feedback, but it's pretty straightforward to like get things sort of negative, to get into the negative feedback. But the problem you run into is that like, can you design your feedback transfer function in such a way that it responds in a fast enough or meaningful enough way? Because, if your spring is like very unspring-like, then it's not really going to do enough. And the dynamics of it, like, it doesn't really work out, and it won't really like bring you very quickly or very effectively back to your nominal position. And so like, there is questions about the dynamics of it and how effectively you can quickly get back without going through wild tangents in the meantime. But just the idea that you have some negative feedback regulating system in here, it's like, it's kind of hard not to help. It's just, can you get it to the point where it helps enough that you get nice ultra stable behavior on the outside of it? So I think like the point really that he's trying to make is maybe a little bit less on the sort of holistic statement that, hey, it's very easy to get ultra stable systems. It's that like negative feedback is like extremely powerful, that and not complicated in some sense. Like, it's pretty simple math, and you can get something in there that helps regulate your system. And you might have to do a little bit of work to regulate it the best way, but just the concept of negative feedback makes it possible very directly.
Right. Mark, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was just following up on that and your synthesizer talk, because it's my understanding that the whole negative feedback concept comes from Nyquist's work at Bell Labs, and so there's the problem of something actually going into oscillation, right? So then the negative feedback can use that, but then as you get finer grained, that you're actually killing you're reducing the harmonic distortion or whatever. So it's like there's the like Steve was saying, there's the major effects, and then you can kind of keep tuning it down. So that's all I wanted to throw in.
Right. And that sort of fine tuning is what gives you like a piano sound out of your synthesizer instead of like a drum. The system's going to make recognizable sound one way or the other, but you do have to be concerned about what you're going to actually get out. And so that gets back to what Shane was talking about, intentionality. Jake, please go ahead.
Yeah, this isn't even necessarily a serious point, but when I was thinking about the little f and the big F, I was thinking of the little f as like this is like a social system, and the little f is like people making a bit too much noise, being a bit too loud, and the big F is the big bureaucracy or the management trying to dampen the noise, and they can get arbitrarily authoritarian, and this big F can get as big as it likes and dominate the system to stop these noisy, loud little Fs. I don't know if that's a serious point or not, but it was amusing me enough that I thought I wanted to share it.
Well, I think when we talk about like the stability of capitalism, this is obviously a relevant concept, right? Like when Deleuze or like, these sort of post-68 thinkers try to think about why capitalism is so stable, they are kind of getting at these negative feedback mechanisms, right? When they try to identify what makes it so adaptive.
That's very interesting, right? Because what part of what you're saying here is that like even relatively unsophisticated feedback mechanisms can be extremely effective, but it doesn't. I think in political theory and stuff, there's also this kind of tendency to if capitalism or the state or whatever abstraction you want to name, if it seems to be effective, then it must be all powerful. It must be like a god, basically, a completely inescapable hyper intelligence that could never be outsmarted. And I think this kind of brings it back down to earth. And it's actually kind of dumb feedback mechanisms are weirdly effective. It kind of does turn out that like if you just have a value signal and a market and some a currency or whatever, and you just glom those things together, it produces emergently a system which is very effective at doing its thing. But that doesn't mean it's not fragile either. It doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't just walk up to it with a hammer and crack it and just be like, the governor on the steam engine is an extremely effective mechanism, but you could go up there with a hammer and just knock that fucking thing off. It's like that's a possibility, right? Like whereas I don't know, maybe somebody embedded in the steam engine might think that the governor is some all present deity that is like completely undefeatable. So yeah, dumb feedback mechanisms can be very effective. They can be remarkably effective.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to the thing Beer was saying about like reacting to unforeseen disturbances. And that's the thing capitalism is really good at, which is why it makes it strategically difficult to get rid of it.
Integrating stuff. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Matt, please go ahead.
Yeah, with the feedback like dominating the system. Yeah, one thing that you can observe with capitalism is that labor discipline is actually prioritized like above like profitability in the narrow sense, which is like I think that's kind of like the same dynamics. It's like it's got this objective, but like this thing that it does in response to anything that could conceivably threaten that objective. Really winds up like looking at its behavior like more than anything else. So like you can look at it obviously with the coup in Chile, for instance, or with all these people doing remote work, how so many of these managers, even when there are studies that show that these time tracking and all that stuff really it's overhead, like it's a drag on productivity, like they're still actually prioritizing just the response to something potentially being out of control than like actual money.
It's setting itself up to win, right? The system of capitalism is in some sense aware of the critical variables, right? Like it needs to keep class consciousness down. It needs to keep profitability up and stuff. But those objectives can be traded off against each other. And the capitalists can set themselves up to win by temporarily ignoring profitability so as to keep labor discipline in place. And that's that's something very important there, that like it's the adaptivity and meta-adaptivity and like adapting like strategies to action, and then strategies to choose strategies for action, and then strategies to choose strategies for action. The bigger that tower is and the more fluid it is, the more effective the overall system can be, even with like relatively unsophisticated machinery.
Yeah, I know we have the whole field of management studies to try to refine that feedback, right? That negative feedback, based on the basic intuition that you give the workers an inch and they'll take a mile. SK, please go ahead.
Yeah, I guess. Sorry, to speak to the math. I think what I find interesting is that in studying AI, the problem being solved by like reinforcement agents is to do away with how to analyze systems something that you've all spoken about. to like do the performative dance until you get to the result you need. So I guess, yeah, I kind of wonder what Beer would say now, like now that there's advances in like understanding of how backpropagation works.
So do you mean in the sense that he might modify the example used in this chapter, or
to use essentially controls as like a target for management, for example? I guess this seems to me still in the state of mind of like let's model the system as opposed to let's perform through the system and see where it leads us.
Yeah, and that was a distinction that Pickering brought up in the cybernetic brain, where he suggested that this kind of early cyberneticians that he talked about were more in the representational mode, and then the later cyberneticians he talked about were more in the performative mode. And I think that because Beer is drawing on Ashby here to give you the fundamentals, there's quite a bit of that representational approach that is influencing his presentation. Okay, but I think your point is very well taken. Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that, we might wrap up our discussion of Chapter 2. Next week is Chapter 3. It's kind of a merger of Chapter 1 and 2, from what I remember. Yeah, let's dig back into more anastomotic reticula for next week.
Before we wrap up,
thanks for showing up, everyone.
I think it was so funny when we interviewed Pickering, and he was like, "Oh, I never figured out how to pronounce that word." He was writing it for years. That was very funny.
I think my pronunciation is right, but maybe I'm not right. I don't know.
Who the fuck knows?
Why? Who knows? But yeah, thanks for participating, everyone. It's been great, and I'll see you same time, same day next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.